Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Floating Communities, a cultural shift back to the rivers. We'll get started with a presentation after I cover a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, by participating in this webinar, you are granting your permission to be recorded and for the recording to be distributed as AIADC and the Washington Architectural Foundation may choose. Second, we'll have time for Q&A after the presentation, so please type any questions you have into that Q&A box. You don't need to wait till the end, you can go ahead and submit them throughout. So now I'm pleased to turn it over to our team from Winstanley Architects and Planners, Michael Winstanley and Lee Jong Hong.
Great, thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you, everybody, and we're very excited to share this content of floating communities and the cultural shift back to the rivers. We got started on this really as a shift from some other work that we have been doing along the river. Some of you might know that we were the authors of the Potomac River Transportation Plan for the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, and that went all the way down as far as Woodbridge. We also spent some time doing master plans at Poplar Point and at Buzzard Point, each of which came along the river edge, and we were asked to look at different development issues that happen along the river edge. And last, we prepared an economic framework plan for the city of Alexandria to help them understand how to turn their riverfront back into an economic engine that it once was. And so this presentation is part of that list of work that we've been doing. We prepared this for a local developer who was interested in it, and we did the research to bring us to the level that you'll see. And in our presentation today, we're going to talk about the evolution of local rivers from transportation and industrial locations to recreation, and now to what we believe is surely more and more housing. We're then going to show you a survey of some of the existing floating communities that exist both in organically developed as well as planned developments of floating communities. And then last, we'll show you the three concepts that we developed along the Potomac and along the Occoquan River. And these are three sites that we developed, and you'll see how these concepts get applied. Next slide. So as the introduction to this, we really wanted to just talk a little bit about river uses. And historically, we know that rivers were the pathways into the continent and allowed the explorers to find their way. And so obviously as transportation routes, they were critical. And because of that, the historical routes of rivers are oftentimes industrial economies based on transportation access, plain and simple. And we can show that in a series of slides here in the Potomac region. But today, as we've seen, recreational activities based on views and on open space and on access to the water have really began to capture people's imaginations. And now you can see, for example, many outposts along the rivers here in the Washington area. And then last, what we believe is that as housing is being drawn to the river edge, mostly based on the views, now we think there's a real shift to allow to have floating communities, which is based on the concept of resiliency, in the sense that floating communities can rise and fall according to the tides and according to storm events, and but also can provide a great deal of wellness and social communities, and that's what we hope to show during this presentation. Lee, next slide. So a slide that I always like to start off with, certainly when we talk about Alexandria, this is Jones Point in the southern section of Old Town Alexandria. And all of this was infill by the Army Corps of Engineers so that they could actually have a boatyard. And you can see here the beginnings of the facilities that were constructed. That ship that sits along the bulkhead there is a deep water port, and they were allowed to get ships that came in quite close. And this is obviously all part of that whole transportation component and the industrial side of this. But what a lot of people have never really realized, next slide, is that Jones Point, long before it was beautiful fields and water's edge, was a huge industrial site, manufacturing plant during World War I, produced something like 400 ships right here. And you can see these are steel ships, so this is not light industry whatsoever. This is very heavy industry. There were over 4,000 people on this site. It was the major economy for the city of Alexandria at this time, and it was all located along the river because of the access. Next slide. But today, as you probably know, the waterfront is booming and teeming, and certainly the investments that the city have made in terms of providing more park space and more activities along the waterfront make it really a prime location for tourism and food and beverage, and housing is, of course, being brought closer to this. Next slide. And the torpedo factory, which is the one of the major draws in Alexandria, is an art community. Of course, has the marina in front of it, but that marina, long before it was a recreation pier, the torpedo factory is named aptly because they made torpedoes. Next slide, Lee. And you can see here in this image that before it was a recreation area along the riverfront, they were manufacturing torpedoes. You can actually see the large building behind the one that was saved, the torpedo factory. There was actually a larger facility in the back. And but you can see here they were rolling out the torpedoes, and it was again a deep water port, so large ships could come in and they could load it up, and it was a very active economy. Next slide. But Alexandria wasn't the only part of the Potomac River that was doing that. In Georgetown, you can see here at the turn of the century, a lot of industrial uses here. Next slide. In fact, you know, the chimneys that exist in Georgetown, which have been protected, I think, historically because of the the history of the site. You can see that there was a large power plant not that far away from the waterfront. Next slide. And there was also a flour mill, and all of these now obviously have been named into office buildings as they were displaced from manufacturing facilities into other types of businesses. But also, like Alexandria, next slide, this riverfront is now, you know, really a recreational riverfront with access for boats, defined bulkhead ways to kind of bring people to and from. And you can see all the housing is very close to the water now because of the views. Next slide. Again, waterfront promenades are replacing the industrial edges of ports and harbors and piers, and goods coming on and goods coming off. And we now have these wonderful boulevards and boardwalks, which frankly lend themselves quite well, as you'll see in some of these later examples, to integrating into floating communities in terms of the new wave of what riverfronts are actually becoming. Next slide. And again, access to the water is critical. And here you can see at the waterfront park in Georgetown, the steps leading down to the water. So it's really about touching the water, and recreation and wellness are all about being engaged with the water and lots of green parks and recreation. And here is a nice slide. You can see the remnants of the industrial past with the tall smokestack in the back. Next slide. And last one that we all know quite well is the wharf. And again, probably late 1800s shot with the schooners along Main Avenue and the wharf. You can see that that edge is really perforated with piers coming in and out. And here you can see the actual waterfront edge. And really, this is a working waterfront. There's not a lot of recreation going down there, and certainly not a lot of people living. I suspect it was a very bustling area, and but filled with a lot of people doing busy stuff and making money and part of the economy. And here you can see the main fish market built in 1805, which we all know the history and has been preserved. And this was a very active area on the waterfront. Next. And now, of course, a rendering of the completed wharf project, and we'll be showing you this as one area in which we believe integrating floating communities can work quite well. Next slide. And lastly, just showing again the promenades in which would be the zippers between the landside development and the floating communities in urban developments. Next slide. Lee? Lee, you're on mute.
I can unmute, making the mistake that everyone makes once or twice during the Zoom period. One of the first things that we did was we really kind of explored all the existing floating communities out there. And, while spending some time looking at them, defined by structures located and occupied directly on water, of course, not along the waterfront, but actually on the water itself. The existing precedents fell underneath two different kind of categories. One was organic and unplanned, and the other one was planned development. These forms also existed in many different kind of shapes and sizes and forms, but the examples I will be showing you is one kind of a large scale example of floating cities that we have seen, and also more inset within the existing communities at large. The first thing that we're going to do is walk you through the organic kind of floating communities around the world. And one of the examples that we wanted to highlight over here is one located in Nigeria, a floating community called Makoko. It's often referred to as the Venice of Africa. The population is around 85,000 people, and it was settled in the 19th century. You can see how there are no kind of defined pathways or waterways, or even in terms of definition of structures, large or small, that define city centers or residential vernacular kind of architecture itself. It just started off as developing off of the land into the water, and you can see it's sprawling into the ocean, and it's being capped by that kind of not railroad, but sorry, highway that is kind of providing a border in terms of the growth and the spread of the floating city right over there. It really truly is an example of an unplanned organic development with no infrastructure. These kind of floating communities that you see in the developing world, they're kind of fueled by a couple of things. One is resources and scarcity in the inland also, but the fact that their economies and the industries are really water-based also. And in terms of Makoko, their two main industries are fishing and lumber. And you'll see in the later slides that it really kind of is a big part of their lives. A lot of them live in those houses, and also kind of step onto the boats and go fishing, and it's a huge part of their industry. And while on the other side, sawmills are also a huge industry in Makoko. While the lumber mills are inland on the waterfront side, the waterways serve as transportation, going back and forth from the source to supplying where needed for the lumber itself. As you can see in this image, this is a kind of a typical image of the a person on a boat and the waterway, and you can see that the existing structures are kind of cheaply constructed on stilts with kind of overhead power lines. It really is kind of closer to a slum than your romanticized view of the floating city that you might have flipping through travel brochures and whatnot. And it has constant risks of flood and issues of airborne waterborne diseases. And there's also a debate in this particular city on whether or not it should be demolished or preserved. And of course, the majority, current thought is to revitalize the area. There are current projects in place to organize the waterways, so you can so these planned communities and developments can have more of a definition to how people are using the waterways for transportation, and two, to build better floating structures. One of the examples that they're currently working on is and have an example of is a floating school, which is quite fascinating in terms of bringing all the kind of the research that we're currently interested in kind of providing to this community itself. You'll see that they're also kind of, with the addition of the fishing and the lumber industries, they are also looking into, bringing agriculture as part of the water-based industries that can fuel the economy of Makoko too. Now, within the whole organic floating communities, on the other side, we looked at organic communities such as Seattle. Everyone knows Seattle is a city in the West Coast, it's a seaport city. The population of Seattle is 10 times that of Makoko, is 800,000. And within the metropolitan area of Seattle is closer to 4 million people. Seattle is bordered by Lake Washington on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side by Puget Sound, which is an inlet of the Pacific Ocean. And you'll see that the red boundaries kind of show where Seattle is located. Lake Union is at the heart of Seattle. This is a view from the northern point of Lake Union, looking down into downtown Seattle where the high rise is. And you can see also the Space Needle at the center upper corner, upper hand of the photograph itself. This image really shows all the kind of activities that are happening on the waterfront itself, and you can start seeing in the center of the photograph the floating communities, the houses that are on the water that are really starting to take flight in Seattle itself. And within Seattle, we're going to walk you through a few examples of the different types of floating communities that currently exist. This map of Seattle kind of highlights some of the areas of where the floating communities currently exist. Lake Union is in the center of this map itself. You'll see that a lot of them are located towards the southern part of Lake Union itself. The first one that we're going to show you is the one that's located on North Lake Marina. It's a floating community that's set in a marina, predominantly, with boats and yachts and fishing boats and whatnot. And the housing is really limited to one pier section of the marina itself. This is an image of the floating community that's set within, and you'll see that, you're starting to see the kind of relationship with the housing that is on the water itself with the other kind of boating activities as traditionally part of the marina. The second example that we're going to show you is in Lake Union Dot, the second kind of the red highlighted zone over here. This community itself is a little bit more of a denser community. It's predominantly a floating community with houses. You'll see that it's spanning 10 piers, And it's organically grown by addition of adding piers along this whole area itself, as per the needs of the floating community. And you can see that it's really resembling a water-based version of a housing neighborhood. And you can see the reference of the more suburban neighborhood off to the right-hand side of the image. This image is taken between the piers, not in the center of the piers, but between the on the waterway of the piers. You'll start seeing that this is, really the prime transportation between from the house, taking, getting on a boat and going out into activities of Lake Union, and also, frankly, kind of providing you transportation off to different areas of Seattle itself. You can start seeing that it really kind of serves as the front part of your house and also the backyard. You see those two red chairs, which is part of the floating house. It really is kind of serving as a public space or private open space to the houses. And during the evening time and during the weekends, you can see that there is a lot of activity that happens outside of these houses that will really contribute towards the social wellness of the people living in this community. And one of the interesting things that we found out was that with communities that are based in these kind of very special kind of structures that are floating communities, that all the neighbors seem to know each other. There's community boards. They're very helpful, and it's kind of a special, unique bond that forms within the community. Some images of the pier entry, the entrance to the pier, each of the individual piers, also kind of going within the pier and seeing how that how the floating houses line up the pier, creating kind of a street frontage, and then also the waterway, kind of seeing that how that waterway looks like in comparison to the street frontage. You can start seeing that the all of these kind of elements really starts having all the equivalencies of a land-based housing community. One where you can see is kind of a gateway entrance into a neighborhood, one that is a street frontage, and also the third one, the waterway being like the backyard, but also serving as a front yard for all of the kind of boats that could be the equivalencies of your cars that are line the fronts of the houses too. The last example in Seattle that we're going to be showing you is it's a community that's located at Hamlin Pier. Is located north of the previous example that we gave. You'll see that in this example, it's a lot more planned. The number of houses is limited, but that yellow kind of arrow that we're showing over here shows you a much wider kind of waterway between the houses. That kind of it makes it a little bit more generous spacing between the houses for easy mobility for the houses to come in and out of the community and to dock itself. For these kind of floating homes, part of it is that in terms of maintenance, or if you were to buy a home and kind of dock yourself on the piers, you need sufficient kind of space between on the waterway for you to be able to tug it, or bring it in into that water lot that you have and kind of place it. So you can see that in these kind of more planned areas, the water lots themselves, there's a little bit larger, the houses are a little bit larger also, the waterways in between a little bit larger. And while all the houses have individual characters to it, there is a certain kind of continuity or I guess equivalent to zoning in terms of making sure that the height and the massings are in line with each other or complementary to each other. And lastly, in the organic kind of example, we wanted to kind of show you compare these two images. Floating communities can, certain housing styles can define cities. And in terms of the image on the left-hand side, you'll see that the image of all the floating homes and then the space middle in the back that really kind of sets up the vernacular or the aesthetic of Seattle, similar to, the iconic houses that you see in San Francisco. I believe this is an image that is frontlines of Fuller House or the Full House. For anyone who is familiar with the 90s TV sitcom. The other category that we explored was planned communities. And, on the flip side to organic and unplanned communities, we're going to walk you through some examples of how these planned communities really impact the aesthetics of the city, and also in terms of economies of how, how very much they can be compared to multifamily development that's happening inland, but on of course using different structures and on the water itself. We're going to take you to Amsterdam in Europe. Amsterdam is an organized water-based city with a large network of canals. It's actually it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Something that I personally found out doing the research. It's obviously a very, very beautiful city and known for quite a few other things than its a floating community, but you can see that all of the boats that line up the canal really adds to the street character and frankly provides a harmony between the apartment living and the water living. Sorry, before we go on to the next image, I forgot to mention that it just as a comparison, Amsterdam has a population of around 800,000, close to 900,000, very similar to Seattle. And within the metropolitan area of Amsterdam, the population is probably 2.4 million people. We're going to show you two examples of planned communities in Amsterdam. One of them is Schoonship. The other one is going to be LJ Burn, which is a little bit further east of this development. Schoonship is quite an inspirational project. Schoonship was brought to you by Space and Matter. It actually, Schoonship translates, if you translate it to English, it actually means clean ship. It's a smart urban planning, and the purpose of it is to create floating, sustainable communities. It's actually deemed to be the most sustainable community within Europe itself, and it started in 2010 and got completed in 2020. It houses 46 unique water dwellings. Each of them, as you can see over here, are very unique to each other. They're designed and tailored for the different kind of families that live there. 46 unique dwellings with 100 residents and also 30 water lots themselves. And so we were just very, very excited to see this example of a planned community. The inspiration behind Schoonship was actually this structure that you see over here. Is a structure that is a meeting house. Is self-sufficient and it really kind of inspired this whole self-sufficient life on the water itself. And from that, a foundation was formed, and search for a appropriate site in Amsterdam was deemed. And in 2010, they found the final location of Schoonship, which is in Johan van Hassel Canal. I'm totally butchering that name, I apologize. But that was the process. So you can see that starting from the inspiration in 2008 and finally kind of mobilizing and finding a location in 2010, and then completing and realizing the project and people occupying 2020. It was a long process, but definitely a process that was very well worth the wait. One of the examples of a house there is a net zero energy house. The architecture, while all very complementary to each other, is still has its own unique character. You'll start seeing here one of the things that we also incorporate in our floating houses is that it has a concrete base float on which the upper structure is built onto. You will see that it is docked onto piers, and you'll see that the anchors on the piers itself really respond to the rising water levels, and and the tide going up and down as the water rises. Some of the features that you'll see is providing as much connection to the water by providing outdoor spaces. You can see that in the corner of this house, an outdoor space that really kind of connects you with the nature and also the water that you're surrounded by. Now, very different, but also as aspirational as the Schoonership project is the L.J. Berg project, which is highlighted over here. This project is 113 floating homes. It's 3 times as big as Schoonership. You'll also see that the horizontality of it and then density of the massing, it kind of resembles a multifamily kind of turned upside down. We were really fascinated by the different piers and how little it touched the land, and the different kind of really meandering pathways that connected all the different piers and joined all of these houses together. Each of the homes are around 1,000 square foot to 1,750 square foot at 1 and 2 bedroom and baths houses, very comparable to the housing that you can find on land. And the other component of it is that it's located very close to the proximity of a support structure that has amenities such as groceries, retail, schools, etc. that really supports this water-based community. You'll see some additional images of this. It really is a hybrid of floating homes and buildings that are built on water. These buildings are set on piers, dikes on the water itself. Netherlands has a history with floating homes, but these new developments that are done in L.J. Berg really resemble actual houses that you can find, modern houses that you can find on land, but are structured and located on water itself. A couple of things that we want to touch upon is financially. How do you buy a house in such a development such as this? And one of the things that we researched and found out was that financially they're classified as immovable property. So it's very much like buying a house. Not only is the interior and the size is comparable to buying a house in London, but financially the purchasing procedures also resemble that. Now, this is not to say that the floating communities that we'll be showing you in our development projects are such that in terms of finances, but we thought it was interesting in this particular example of how that worked out. And on the very extreme spectrum, particularly as it relates to the very first floating city that we showed you in Nigeria, we wanted to kind of end the examples of the floating communities by showing you this iconic example. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this one. It's a hyper-planned floating cities of the future, and by BIG. And it really addresses the rising sea levels, the hurricanes. It's a solution to space societies that have potential to be an alternative to land living. These are this oceanic city is meant to be a self-sustaining community that is adaptable to any kind of culture or architecture and located around the world itself. So now we're going to move on to showing you some of the work and the research that we have done on the 3 different sites in the Washington D.C. metro area and also in the vicinity. Like Michael had said before, our interest in floating communities was a natural progression from our study on the Potomac River Transportation Framework Plan, and also our work on the Alexandria Riverwalk Framework Plan. We have a very special interest in the economies of water and addressing wellness and sustainability and resiliency as it pertains to water and water-based kind of development. And we're very excited to share our ideas on next week's examples that we have. The first one is the Wharf DC. I'm going to flip through all of this stuff. The wharf is located in the southwest DC quadrant. And that highlighted area is the site of the wharf. I'm going to quickly move these ones. The wharf itself is a mixed use development, and mixture of offices, apartments, condominiums, hotels. The green arrows that you see over here are really the street frontage to the wharf itself, to the waterfront, and the arrows kind of take you out to piers that really connect you to the water itself. You'll start seeing the water taxis that transport you from this waterfront to other waterfronts in Washington DC, such as Georgetown, the National Ballpark, to also the Alexandria Riverfront also. Now, the site that we were working on is part of phase one. The phase one site you can see was located right at the last pier that you see. Part of the work that we are going to show you would be part of phase two. Within phase two, the area that we focus on is the one highlighted in red over here. It's taking out, Southwest is a very heavily marina-based community. Don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but here's some of the existing photographs of the existing boating community. You'll see that a lot of boats, a lot of fishing boats, yachts, and also houseboats. And these houseboats are kind of dispersed throughout the marina itself. And some of them look like houses, some of them look like boats, and some of them are actually boats that you can live on to, that you can actually rent out or even buy. And so the Southwest DC has a true kind of mix of different types of water-based living. But once again, it's a very tight-knit community and very social community too. Our proposed plan includes, keeping the existing proposed piers in place and kind of creating a densified zone in the northern part of the boundaries that you see over here, and also locating floating homes along the right-hand side of the pier, where one side would be houses, another side will be docking spaces for boats. These are some aerial views of the proposed floating community. One of this planned community is one where it's adjacent to a mixed-use development. So a lot of the amenity spaces, or such as retail, groceries and whatnot, would be inland. And the proximity to having an alternative living than the condominiums and apartments on the wharf DC, and it was something that was very exciting as we started this project. And you can start seeing over here in a little bit more detail that which we incorporated a lot of sustainable features, such as floating islands over here that deal with the water filtrations, and also incorporating solar energy and also green roofs onto the houses too. In terms of the massing of the buildings, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the later examples, but we also wanted to create a community where there is a certain kind of language to the individual houses, but also kind of also make sure that the massings are not all the same, but have enough variations between each of the houses so that they can live comfortably adjacent to each other. We wanted to also maximize the glazing at the water level to connect to the water itself, and also in terms of maximizing the views out from the house to the water. Kind of close up, showing you some of the panoramic views of the water side of the community itself. So the envisioning for these houses was more of a modern take of it. You'll see that we incorporated nano walls in the water level itself in the living room, so you can open it all up and have a direct kind of connection to the water itself. There's cutouts on the float itself to make room for parking, any kind of boats or water-based kind of transportation adjacent to it. And also kind of carving out open spaces in the upper levels for balconies and also for roof access on the very top itself. One of the important things for us was to ensure that these each of these homes was a sustainable, self-sufficient structure on water. So we're going to go through some of the environmental sustainable features that we have on these houses. First one is envelope and mechanical. The entire envelope is insulated. Make sure that we have the right R values for all the insulation that goes around the wrapping or the outside of the envelope of the building itself. The glass proposed is a low E glass, incorporating natural ventilations into it, so that you can really take advantage of the wind and the ventilation that happens on the water itself. In terms of the cooling and heating, we are proposing to use water source heat pumps. You'll see that in the lower right-hand corner, how that would work in terms of where it's located and how that would go in and out of the structure itself. In terms of the floors, we're proposing radiant flooring and also solar water too. For water, we're proposing rainwater harvesting. So you can collect all the water that comes from outside into a water storage tank and use that for the purposes of appliances and home appliances, and also for the fixtures themselves. The green roof itself will also kind of cool any kind of heat buildup on the roof itself. The solar panels that we have up there, one of the things that we're also exploring is there is currently a hybrid of solar panels and water producing solar panels itself, hydro panels that actually take the moisture from the air using solar panel energy and converting into drinking water. So we're also exploring that as an alternative energy and water source for the houses too. Lastly, in terms of power and lighting, of course, we have the solar panels that will produce electrical energy and power for the house itself. The use of LED light fixtures, making sure that we have lighting control so that you're not using unnecessary lights during the daytimes and whatnot, and making sure that there is glazing that addresses daylight into the houses so that the use of light fixtures will be minimized. This is a view from inside the waterway, kind of showing you how the space between the houses can really kind of not only give you a little bit of privacy between it, but also start engaging the people and giving you a sense of neighborhood from within the water itself. The second example that we're going to walk you through is Dock 79. It's a project that is around the corner from the Wharf DC. It is south of the the Nats ballpark. It's part of a mixed-use development. It's very different from the Wharf in the sense that it's predominantly residential with retail on the ground floor. And the idea behind this is the site that we're looking at right over here. And this is a rendering from MRP, who are the developers of the development itself. You'll see that the two buildings that you see are residential buildings with retail on the ground level. And you'll start seeing that that they were thinking about a pier that was also had food and beverage and retail on the piers itself. And this is a image of the proposed floating pier with food and beverage and retail kind of program that they were working on. After which we came back and we were asked to take a look into their waterfront property and see how our floating homes can be incorporated as part of this development. Different from the wharf, where it was mainly the floating homes that were connected to the development. This one, we are proposing to have limited floating homes, but also have a retail orientated water structure on the southern part of it. Let's keep going. Oh, one of the things that came out from our river transportation framework plan was to also have a water taxi stop at this area, and so you'll see that in the on the right hand side of the pier, that would also be a spot for a water taxi stop that would also be incorporated as part of the restaurant and spaces that we have allocated there. Looking into the floating home community, which is part of the right-hand side of the development, you'll see an entrance off of the pier that will take you into what we call the main gateway to the floating community. But another entrance that we also kind of created was directly off of the development, almost like a side entrance to the development itself. Some rendering, some views from the Anacostia River. Similar to the Wharf DC, the idea behind this was to create a kind of a housing that would sit well with each other, but in a little bit more of a colorful context. You'll start seeing how that massing kind of differs from the retail or the food and beverage side of the floating community. Well, once again, it was to maximize views out into the water, connect you to the water itself, and to also make sure that we have planned areas on the piers for community spaces within. You'll see here in terms of the network of how the homes come together, the yellow, the main yellows that thicker yellow areas that go from left to right are the main piers that kind of where all of the homes are docked into. And then the secondary, what we call the tertiary pathways, are the ones that go from north to south, the ones that connect directly into the development, into these floats that do not have a structure on it. They're kind of, they're meant to be open spaces that connect you from one pier to the next pier so that you don't feel isolated. And you'll see highlighted those kind of public areas within the community, so we can enhance social wellness within the floating community also. One of the things that was also very important to us when creating these typologies for each of the floating homes was to make sure that that you don't have a straight edge line. These kind of zigzags and ins out that you see over here, they're really meant to create not only a kind of an outline that is that really kind of mimics natural kind of landscape, but also areas in which you can park your water-based transportation, boats, water skis, all of that kind of stuff. And we're going to walk you through some of the typologies that we came up with. The units over here, consistent to keep in mind, is an alternative to living in DC in the mainland. So we looked at creating homes that were between 800 square foot to 2,000 square foot. And in terms of the, and we kind of categorize that not only in terms of size, but we went from how big is the water lot itself. And then actually maybe the next image will be better. We went from how big should a water lot be, and then from there looking into how much of how much space does the float need to be, the float meaning the structure on which the house is located, how much does the float need to be pulled back from the water lots in order for them to give buffer for maneuvering and also to bring to anchor the housing, the structures into place. Then we also looked at how much of that float should be carved out for parking your water transportation in terms of boats and other kind of, jet skis and other kind of water-based activity stuff, so that it's not in your house. And then lastly, once we found the different, found the kind of leftover mass shapes for the floating, for the floats, then we looked into massing the houses so that not only are you maximizing your views out into water, but also making sure that we're creating outdoor spaces within that float. So you can not only have your nano wall where you can sit inside the living room and look out, but you can also have outdoor spaces where you can socialize with your neighbors and also kind of be very connected to the water itself. Yep. The third example, Michael, I'm going to hand this over to you. The third example is Belmont Bay in Woodbridge. You're muted.
Thank you, Lee.
Mm-hmm.
You want to bring it? Yep. So the first two examples we showed you were urban developments with lots of infrastructure all around it. And we had the opportunity to look at also a suburban location, which obviously posed different challenges for us as we kind of looked at it. But the next project you're going to see in terms of its site context is absolutely a suburban location. And what that means is that we need to have more infrastructure nearby to support the facility. These floating communities can't exist entirely by themselves. They need to be connected to land-based infrastructure. And so in this next development, you'll see that we had a chance to actually evaluate that and create some ideas of how to actually accomplish that. And then from a sustainability perspective, again, it's completely different between an urban and a suburban environment. And so in this case, what you'll see is that we really tried hard to minimize the impact on the water edge. And we had main buildings offshore. I'm sorry, we constructed, like all of these, we constructed the homes offshore, and they're brought in by tug and put in place. What we didn't share with you is that the technology for this now is to pour the floating concrete shell foundations, pour them on land, and you actually literally launch them down a ramp. And when they're floating, you then bring the carpenters on to the platform and they start building. And once it's constructed in a boatyard or in a very controlled area where there's lots of tools and the ability to get product in and stuff like that, then they're once completed, they're then floated in via tug and securely fastened to the infrastructure that's already in place. And then we spent more time actually looking in terms of the suburban model. We had a chance, because this is a larger community, we had a chance to update a little bit the layouts and the typology that Lee just went through with you, and to something a little bit different. And there was some nuance with it, as well as getting larger environments and some accessory structures attached to it. And then the last is just in urban environments, you're in communities already, you're attached to communities. In this one, it's a more suburban environment. And so for us, creating social resiliency, both in wellness and in just social interaction, was really critical for us. So people didn't feel isolated in the suburban environments. Next slide, Lee. So this is a context map showing you Washington, D.C. at the top. And we've already shown you floating communities both on the Anacostia River and on the Potomac River. And this one is actually going to be in Belmont Bay, which you can see is south. It's adjacent to Woodbridge. Belmont Bay is in Woodbridge, and this one is actually on the Occoquan River. Next slide. And here is a little bit of an enlargement of the area that we're going to be focused on. For those of you who know this area, this is also the area in which the fast ferry is planned to go into. And the early view is that there's enough military personnel down in the Woodbridge area that it could support a fast ferry to the JBAB base as a starting point, and that would be upriver, just slightly upriver to the marina that exists just slightly above the yellow circle we have there. So there is active transportation that we hope will be soon going to and from. And but we'll zoom in on this area. Next slide, Lee, so you can see. So in Belmont Bay, there's a series of developments as part of the Belmont Bay community. And one of the components that they've evaluated is leaving some of the area as a reserve, a nature reserve, as part of the development. What you see here is the red area that has been dedicated to recreation and walking paths. And in fact, you should be able to walk from here all the way over to the ferry. They're working on connections along the water edge there. And the yellow area is a little inlet that's about 10 feet deep in its center. And that's the area that we've been asked to look at. And it's a highly protected area from storms. And it was really a good area for us to look at in terms of locating a larger facility. But you can see that just to the south of that yellow area is a suburban neighborhood, some townhouses on the edge of being more urban, but really predominantly a suburban area. Next slide. And when we zoom in on the area, this is the site plan for the Belmont Bay development. It's approximately 150 homes on the water. And there's two components to this now that we're providing. You can see the area of the floating community, the floating homes that are attached to the land, and we'll get through that attachment. But really, most importantly, is you can see now we're providing land-based facilities in support of the homes, which includes parking and two outbuildings that have community components in it, and provide just a little bit more resource for the homes so that they feel like they are part of a community. And when visitors come, there's a general way to show up. Here is an aerial view of that same area, and you can see a lot of the stuff that we learned up in the urban areas. We are integrating here. What I just highlighted here is the land-based facilities, which includes that. We'll show you a little bit more next slide. And these we didn't need in the urban environments, but we did here. So as some support areas, so you can see the arrows are the areas in which we're connecting to the wharfs themselves. And these would be put in place prior to the homes coming in. Parking, toilet, locker, laundry facilities. Obviously, some of the homes would have their own laundry facilities, but if they did not have them, there would be communal facilities, and then a communal space that could provide for events or community meetings or the neighborhood ANCs, et cetera. But you can see that that's what the land-based facilities do provide. Next slide. And in this case, we have a little bit of a water main street for visitors. So visitors would come either by car to the main area and park, or if they came by boat, there'd be a main street that allows people in boats. The lighthouse was really just to provide some sort of iconic location that would log it. And these are views from the boat or from the water, showing again floating wetlands that we've integrated. Go ahead to the next slide, Lee. And then this just gives you blow-ups of the detail of trying to create a community in which had open space, had communal areas. Go ahead, Lee. And you can see really trying to knit together a community, one in which people felt as if there was both privacy and a collective communal spaces that that really contributed to the community. Next slide. So from an environmental perspective, again, we talked about just not touching the waterfront edge and leaving it as natural as possible. You can see that the dashed line is the waterfront edge that we have not touched. The yellow circles are where the gangplanks are to get us over to the community. And then the solid blue edge is a bulkhead so that we can uh, uh, have boats come up along the edge and disembark and embark out. Next slide. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we integrated the wetlands into the project as well, the floating wetlands, to try to increase the amount of sustainability of the project itself. Next slide. So looking more carefully now at the housing component, you can see that we have three basic neighborhoods. And how did we connect these neighborhoods amongst themselves? You can see that, like Dock 79, we learned a lot about how to create these livable neighborhoods. The dashed areas, the dashed green areas, indicate areas in which we've actually dedicated public space. So not all the piers, not all the docks, or sorry, not all the floats that are along the docks have houses on them. We wanted to have a little bit of relief. So when we put a bridge in, some of the bridges are movable so we can get the homes out, as float them out as well as float them in. But we also included some open space where they can be town squares or mini urban hardscape parks, or just areas in which people can collect and engage and have some public space. And you can see how it connects all back to the mainland and the land-based facilities. Next slide. And so in this particular case, you'll see that the sizes of the units have actually grown. And in the past, I think they were under 1,000 to 2,000 and 2,500. Now we're at, you know, say type A is an 1,800 to 2,200, and it has a 50 by 50 water lot, which is what you see at the very top. Type B, what we wanted to do was to increase it and also create the ability to have accessory structures so that you could have a guest house or a writer's house or a work-live situation. You could also just use it for storage. Again, the whole concept of notching the foundation platform so that water-based transportation can find a home in there as well within the area that you're buying. And then type C was getting larger lots, which was, or larger homes, to be competitive within the suburban market of 2,400 to 3,200. Now you can see that the water lots have grown to 75 by 50. And then in type D, what we did was we did just essentially the larger home with the accessory structure, but it was a secondary lot. Secondary lot, which was across the way, just so to keep a lot of interaction and to make the pathways active and more public. This could also lead to work, that the accessory building could actually be a work location that people could receive people there, either professionals of some kind. But again, we're just looking for those types of flexibility to work all within this system. And highlighted in the green again is the location for your water-based transportation, whether it be a boat or a ski-doo or a canoe or a rowboat, whatever. There's locations there to dock your boats. Next slide. And this just illustrates a model that we created to illustrate the relationship between the floating homes within the lagoon area and then the natural landscape on the land-based, showing the land-based facilities, but then keeping it very natural and not touching any of the other land around there. And I think that's it. And Lee, I think the last slide is yours.
Thank you, Michael. We wanted to end the presentation with this kind of it's a clip from my Instagram actually, and it really just emphasizes the idea of wellness, and I think that this is a very prevalent, especially now as we're emerging out of COVID and the pandemic itself. But during the pandemic, I think most of us kind of experienced the cabin fever, being cooped up in your apartments, having live work on top of each other. But imagine if you were living in a floating community where even though your walls may be a 10 by 10, you're actually connected to the water, where your views are not limited by, let's say, another kind of apartment building 20 feet away or whatnot. So we truly do believe that the floating communities, not only are they resilient in terms of addressing the grander water level and rising water level issues, and they can also be self-sufficient and sustainable, but they really do contribute to the wellness of social wellness with tight-knit communities, and also just having this being part of nature. And so thank you so much for listening to our talk on this.
Thank you, and we look forward to taking your questions.
Great, thank you so much for presenting these case studies to our group. That was really fascinating. So with that, we will turn it over to questions.